have one? A PowerPoint? So you must. Thank you.
Okay, so to change the slide, we do. Okay.
Well, it's 12:45. I guess we need to get started. Well, great. I hope everybody had a filling lunch, and we are going to continue on here with the workshop. And our next panel is when and where to intervene on invasive species, control at early and middle and late stages of infestation, costs and successes. So we're going to hear from several folks here. First, we have Rayola Jacobsen, the Invasive Species Coordinator with the Bruneau River Soil and Conservation District. Justin Bush, Executive Coordinator with Washington Invasive Species Council. Helmuth Rogg, Director of Plant Program Area with Oregon Department of Agriculture, and Ielmini, the National Invasive Species Program Lead with the U.S. Forest Service. So we're going to go from sort of more of a local field to then end at the national level. So we are going to begin with Rayola. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Well, we started this with one idea in mind, and this is now the third version. So I would like to ask a question to start. If I were to use the word hydrilla, how many in the room with a show of hands would know what I was referring to? Oh, good. Moving right along. So you know it's really a noxious, horrible weed. So this gives you a little idea. How did we find hydrilla in the Bruneau River? First of all, Bruneau River is located in southwestern Idaho, a very remote region. Both sides of the Bruneau River have private landowners. There's very little public access. And so there's a certain member of the Idaho State Department of Agriculture staff who was duck hunting in the area who is a botanist, and he recognized this weed and recognized that there were huge mats of this weed. And his name is Tom Wolf, and he's now over here in Montana. We really appreciated Tom and what he found. Hydrilla's on the EDRR list in Idaho, so that meant we had to do something about it right away. There was a bit of a problem with that, because not only do we find hydrilla in the geothermal upwellings of the Bruneau River, we find a listed endangered species called the Bruneau hot springs snail. Now, with this listing in 1993, it brought extreme adverse reaction from the local community towards any entity of government at all. So when Tom was trying to meet with the local landowners to say we really need to do something about this weed, they wouldn't talk to him or return his calls. I, however, have been raised in the area, so I encouraged them strongly to come to a meeting with Tom and I, and we explained what was going on, and they were still, okay, how much is this gonna cost? What do you want me to do? And are you gonna hit me with regulations? That was their fear. They had a fear. When we explained there would be no regulations, that there was a funding mechanism, that it would not cost them anything, they began to work with us. It has now blossomed to a relationship where the folks from the Department of Agriculture can drive through their herds of cattle, can leave gates as they find them, and are encouraged to park in their yards so they can maintain protection over their vehicles. There is no other government agency that can access any of this in that valley. So not only did hydrilla present a terrible problem, it also presented a resolution and a coming together of many different agencies and entities, not least of which was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because you cannot go into this area of the Bruneau River and remove hydrilla because there were millions and billions with a B of these snails attached to the hydrilla because they like the same temperatures. Now the Bruneau snail, let's see, if you look in the corner, you will see an image of a snail. It's magnified many times because the usual size of a snail is the point of your pen or a fly speck. The young ones are like fly specks. And as you can see, we found them in the same area. Now, the dot above the arrow is Boise, Idaho. They found 3 or 4 plants in an irrigation ditch that had warm water running in it because someone had, quote, dumped an aquarium there. So they maintain watch on that, and that's been eradicated. The 2 dots below the arrow are in Twin Falls, Idaho, where hydrilla were found below aquaculture entities, and those have been primarily eradicated. If you look at the graph, you can see that in 2010, we had huge masses of hydrilla. And in 2017, we have 14 plants. Now, we're still working the river in 2018, so I cannot give you a number. But hydrilla tubers remain active or can grow again after 10 years. So they will be monitoring, patrolling, and pulling tubers and other findings in the river for many years. When we first found them, there was a 12-mile reach of the Bruneau River, as you can see by the illuminated green area. If you'll look on the other slide, you'll see down at the very bottom, that's where we found the 14 plants. So we really consider this a success story in more than one way. We in Idaho are very privileged because our weed program is funded. Governor Otter said, I want to see dead weeds, give me dead weeds. And they appropriate money from the general fund to pay for our CWMAs. For our boat check stations, which has to do with prevention, there's the sale of invasive species stickers through the boat registration deal. And our Marine Patrol deputies have literally pulled boats off of reservoirs and made them go and buy their stickers. They cannot launch without a sticker. And we don't give tickets unless they really, really earn one. Our invasion curve, as you can see, is we really need to stop these prior to introduction. Did we stop the hydrilla prior? No. Was there early detection? Obviously not. And if it hadn't been for Mr. Wolf, we probably would still be in ignorance, just wondering how we were going to get rid of these mats. But first they tried chemicals, then they tried hand diver-operated suction dredges, and there's where Fish and Wildlife Service and Corps of Engineers came in, because you can't work in the bed of a river without Corps of Engineers giving you approval of your plan. And Fish and Wildlife Service, we had to design a special catch basin with many, many openings so that when the suction dredge threw the biomass in, the snails could be dislodged and fall through the openings. Don't ask. We did it like they asked us to. So disrupt the introduction. When they got done with the mother plant, which was at the head of the hot springs, into the Bruneau River, they found rocks from an aquarium. We are only assuming that an aquarium dump caused that whole process, and it went on for many years. So disrupt the movement, try to do prevention. If prevention fails, look at your earliest possible intervention. Bring together all different entities and work cooperatively. We had Department of Agriculture as the lead agency, local landowners and irrigation companies, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, Idaho Office of Species Conservation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, United States Department of Agriculture, APHIS, and the Bruneau River Soil Conservation District, as well as the Corps of Engineers. And without the entire group, we couldn't have come to the successful conclusion that we feel like we have today. So then, about the same time, mussels came on the scene. And Idaho established a defensive perimeter of 20 stations with 3 roving stations in the interior. We have a roving crew out of Boise, 1 out of Coeur d'Alene in the northern part of the state, and 1 out of Idaho Falls in the eastern part of the state. And we've had some very surprised people back in the wilderness areas when they come to a boat launch area and there sits an inspection station. And they're very cooperative usually back there, but we get a lot of out-of-staters who are not. So what do we do about that? Well, the 2 bottom stations, as you can see, there's a Bruneau station and a Marsing station in Owyhee County. Those are the stations I manage, and we are privileged and blessed to work with our county sheriff, who took it on early as saying part of his responsibility was to protect the water as well as the land and the people that he served, and I hire his deputies and other deputies when they have a day off or have vacation time. They have to be a level 1 certification in order to be insured by ICRIMP to do a pursuit vehicle, and do we need pursuit vehicles? Well, there were 66 attempted drive-bys of the Marsing station in the month of August. There were 24 attempted drive-bys at the Bruneau station. Why is that? Because the Marsing station has more out-of-state boaters. We get a lot of California people coming up and some Utah people. We also get people from the state of Florida and Wisconsin, and every state in the union has been through our 2 stations. So the Bruneau station last year did 3,077 inspections, and we hot washed 17. The Marsing station did 2,169, they hot washed 24, they found 3 fouled boats. Weeds, 13 boats carried weeds. 7 were aquatic, 6 were terrestrial. Our statewide totals, as you can see, were 110,285 inspections. We hot washed 6,884, and a hot wash is different than a decontamination. A hot wash can take 10 minutes, a decon can take a full day. We found 50 fouled boats, both live and non-active, weeds 352, 268 aquatic, and terrestrial 58. And these are some pictures of some of the boats with weeds and what it looks like. They're hand cleaned and then hot washed, so we don't transport any weeds. So with that, we consider ourselves pretty lucky where we are in our little corner of the world, because we do have funding, we do have cooperation, and we do have a lot of support at the state legislature and our governor and the folks we send back to Congress. So with that, thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Rayola. Next, we have Justin Bush, Executive Coordinator with the Washington Invasive Species Council.
Great. Well, thank you for this opportunity. On behalf of the state of Washington, I'd like to thank the Western Governors Association, our host, Governor Bullock, and Chairman Ige for taking this on. This has been a fantastic opportunity to look at shared issues across the West, and I've heard some really great potential solutions, and I'm thinking that there are going to be a lot of great outcomes coming out of this meeting. So for some quick background, I coordinate the Washington State Invasive Species Council. We were created by the state legislature in Washington State in 2006, and we're tasked with policy level direction and coordination at a statewide scale. And currently the council has 22 different member organizations, bringing together tribal governments, bringing together federal agencies, state agencies, regional organizations, and nonprofits. And our intent is to take a cross-section of every group that's dealing with the same common issue in Washington to find one approach to allow us to be most efficient and effective. And within our task, we're supposed to be doing this at the state scale, but what I see here is making me feel really great because I see us doing this at a Western region, and I'm hearing the same common stories at the national level as well. So I think we're making a lot of progress on this issue, and I think there are a lot of good things that are going to be coming out of this meeting. So again, thanks to the Western Governors for taking this on. The first thing that I wanted to point out, and before I get into Some of the talking points I'll be mentioning is that the Invasive Species Council in Washington actually pulled together a working group to look at this issue and to give me some talking points on what we feel has been effective in Washington State, and also some gaps that we've seen, and some potential solutions that maybe we could work together on in the West. And so first and foremost, I just really want to point out that as invasive species managers, we really need to focus on developing common, harmonized messaging for invasive species. So we've seen different messages around not moving firewood and managing pathways, but a common story that we've heard all day is that how do we elevate the issue of invasive species at the local level, at the regional level, at the state scale, and also the national level, knowing that every issue is important. How does an invasive species compete against things like mental health, security, and other important issues? We know that invasive species cost us billions of dollars a year in terms of losses that harm our economy and our environment equally, to the tune of $1 billion. So this is an emergency, and this is an important issue. How do we convey that message in one comprehensive way throughout the West and regionally and throughout the United States to really speak with one voice so that we will amplify our effects around shared issues? And I've been hearing about that a lot today, and I'm thinking we're getting there. But this is a basic issue of communication that is hindering our success in rapidly responding to new issues. This is really kind of a fundamental problem. Secondly, we need to continue to emphasize prevention and preventive actions across the West. We've seen this most recently with invasive mussels, quagga and zebra mussels, and there's been a great national effort building on regional efforts and local efforts. Really, the West has been united on preventing the introduction of invasive mussels to our region. How do we take those lessons learned and to apply them to all different types of invasive species? Infectious diseases, noxious weeds, terrestrial animals. There are all sorts of different issues that could be looking at the same model, and it could be more successful if we follow that same template. So how can we work together to prevent these issues first and foremost? And then how can we develop new tools and partnerships that are going to allow us to be more efficient and effective in rapidly responding? And in Washington, we've been exploring new force multipliers through the use of memorandum of understandings with federal agencies and with local agencies, giving our state's aquatic invasive species authorities that are pretty strong to other organizations. So knowing that we're competing for limited resources and there's limited staff, how can we help each other with new things like MOUs and sharing things that aren't necessarily fiscal in nature? How can we work together in new and innovative ways? And, at the most basic level, I think there's a real need for decision support tools and processes. So if a new issue arrives, and I work at a state scale, so if something new shows up in Washington, how do we know if there's a high risk within Washington State? What do we know could be impacted? How do we rapidly analyze the issue to know if we should trigger response activity immediately? Oftentimes, by the time we know something's an issue and we've documented that in such a way that there's consensus, there's no hope for eradication. So how can we create technical advisory groups and learn from other managers in the West and other managers nationally and potentially globally to look at new issues and not reinvent the wheel in terms of determining whether or not it's an issue or when you should trigger rapid response? And I think that we could learn a lot from looking at the models for invasive insect management. So I'm looking forward to Helmuth building on this in a moment. But beyond that, I also wanted to say that we need to change our perspective on early detection and rapid response. First detections of a new invasive species constitute an environmental and an economic emergency. Like any type of emergency, there needs to be a standardized approach and response. So we need to treat invasive species like a wildfire, like an oil spill, like a train derailment. How can we prepare ourselves to respond immediately to new issues? And the way that I feel the West could come together to do this is by immediately working to identify and classify resources that are available for rapid response. What people are available? Are they trained? How can they help? Who has a boat? Who has gill nets? Who has containment booms, and where are they? So that in Washington State, for example, if we are going to proclaim an emergency and convene an incident command team to deal with a new issue, who do we write a letter or request to asking for assistance? And I think that we should look at wildfire as a model, and how do we build fire caches for invasive species management? If we want to remove rapidly, we need to know who's going to be invited to the party and where exactly they are at the most basic level. So I think that this is a broad challenge, but I also think that this issue's already been elevated substantially within the last 10 years, and it's continually growing. I think that we're on the cusp of uniting as a region and working together across the West on shared issues, and I see that in things like the recent Western Governors Association top priority species list of the West. How can we, again, unite around common messaging and priorities? And what's been really great to see is that there's already being funding directed at those species that have been outlined through the Western Governors Association process. So how can we take that model and continue to build on that and continue to develop our capacities to build effective and efficient programs? So thank you for your time and attention, and the Washington Invasive Species Council stands ready to support our regional efforts against this.
Thank you, Justin. Next, we will hear from Helmuth Rogg, who is the Director of Plant Program Area, Oregon Department of Agriculture. Helmuth.
Well, thank you, Leah. I guess the pressure is on here from Justin. But I want to echo what Justin said in his opening remarks. I think this is a great opportunity that we elevate what we already experience on the ground level to the political level, how important invasive species are to our states. So, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, obviously representing the state side of plant protection that Gary in the morning described. We may be structurally different in the various states, but we have similar missions. With the State Department of Ag, we're protecting our natural resources and we're protecting our agricultural economy from invasive species. So I want to give you a very brief overview of plant protection from the state side. Gary described the federal side, but here's a very important link because state and federal agencies work very closely together. And I'm not just saying that because Gary is stronger and bigger than me, but because that cooperation is really working well on state level, on regional level, and on national level. Yes, like in any marriage or relationship, there's ups and downs, but in general, this is a really good relationship and cooperation that we have. On funding side and also on the technical side, funding, as Gary said, we receive funding, the states. Part of it's funded by state fund, but we receive a lot of federal funds to protect our states and country from invasive species. And that goes through Farm Bill and CAPS. There's lots of acronyms. I'm, for instance, the SPRO, the State Plant Regulatory Official, working with the SPOT, which is the State Plant Health Director. And, sorry about this, and we receive funding from the CAPS program, that's the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey Program, that gives us funding to look for specific targets that we are concerned about. How do we do that in general? The federal government has authority at the borders and in the state movement and protects us from invasive species coming into the country. And the states have the authority within the state. And we have quarantines, as we heard, with noxious weed or any other invasive species. We set up quarantines for the purpose to prevent them coming into the state in the first place. And I will give an example how important that is, the prevention part. But as we know, not everybody stops at a stop sign. So to follow through, we have surveys and look for specific insects or noxious weed and make sure that they're not in the state. If they're in, if we find them, we find out with delimitation surveys how far they spread. And if we have the opportunity and the means, we go after them and try to eradicate them. We have legacy programs in the country, in particular in the western part, gypsy moth, Japanese beetle. We have very good detection tools, and we have very good eradication tools to go after those invasive pests, which are well established in the eastern part of the US. If we can't eradicate, like we've seen here, the eradication curve, it's always good to be in the preventive mode, but if we can't, we look for management options. We have very good biocontrol methods in noxious weed. Dave Bergier probably can contest to that. We have biocontrol agents that we set out for noxious weed. We also have biocontrol agents for invasive insects, brown marmot stink bug. So there's many options that we have to get that going. So I want to get to the prevention part and the funding part and EDRR and demonstrate how intimate that is related and give you a real life example from Oregon. So in 2008, with the beginning of the economic recession, our budgets were tight. And in Oregon, we have mandatory budget cuts that can be taken by the governor and the legislator or not. But in this case, we had to cut our programs, in particular the insect pest program. And the first thing we do is we look for, obviously, this is state funding we're talking about. We're cutting, we don't put as many traps out. So in 2008, we reduced the Japanese beetle survey by half because I had to reduce the budget. In 2016, we found the largest Japanese beetle infestation in Oregon's history. We found 368 Japanese beetle, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this was 90% of all Japanese beetle that we collected since the 80s. Well, it got a little worse. 2017, we had 24,000 Japanese beetle in northwest Portland. This had to do because we didn't have enough traps in the area. We had to limit the funds to go after high-risk sites like airport where we know Japanese beetle is coming in, or nurseries that bring in stock from Japanese beetle-infested areas. So we missed residential neighborhoods because we didn't have the funding. Now, I had to go to the E-board, the emergency board of the legislature, and ask for more money because we didn't have enough funding. So to make that story short, and as you notice, I'm not a native from Oregon, I'm metric, so you remember the saying, 1 gram of prevention is worth a kilogram of cure. You figured it out. Or pay me now or pay me more later. That was what I said to our legislative committees. By saving $80,000 to $100,000, we're currently, and we're in year 2 of our eradication, Japanese beetle eradication project, we're already at $2.5 million. This project will probably last, if we are able to eradicate it, at least another 3 to 5 years. So we're looking at probably $5+ million. So you tell me. So this is, I think, a good example. We use it all the time. Next year, I will be the chair for the Oregon Invasive Species Council, so we have similar functions here. But I think one of the lessons is that we can't do the job alone. And we've heard it over and over in these panels. We have to cooperate, we have to work together, and we have to find common language that we can convey what is important here, that we protect us from invasive species. Thank you.
Thank you, Helmuth. Our final panelist is Mike Ielmini with the USDA Forest Service.
Well, thanks, everyone. And I don't want to just echo a lot of the things that my colleagues have said about working together, but this meeting itself is one of those great working together things on behalf of the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Perdue, and our Chief of the Forest Service, Vicki Christensen. And we're a proud sponsor to help with this, but really this is absolutely fantastic to see the governors elevating this. The Chairman Ige and what Governor Bullock mentioned, this is not just a one and go. We're going to continue this effort. So this connect the dots and help each other and work collaboratively. I want to leave us with a few summary points that might have kind of ring true. Many of you have already said some of these things in the other panels, and in this panel here. When and where to intervene, early, often, and everywhere. That's it, okay? The little things can get out of hand, so you got to catch them early. And it's not just one thing, and it's not just one species, it's not just one taxa, it's not just one state, one ecosystem, it's everywhere. We got invaders coming at us from every angle. So early, often, and everywhere. That's EDRR. Second line of defense, as Governor Bullock mentioned, put as much energy into that as you do prevention. So that's critical. You will lose the game on prevention in many ways. It's a very porous barrier, but it's a capacity issue in that regard. So we will have leaky prevention programs. So be ready and prevent your disgruntledness when it slips through your cracks. So you want to be able to move at and act. A quick response is necessary. And to do that, we're talking about scale here. So what's effective and what's not? Well, we've seen lots of scales. We've heard lots of stories about different scales. It is a scales issue. At the local, small scale, success might be viewed as very easy to accomplish from an EDR standpoint and the intervention of our activities to deal with that. And the higher in scale you might go, the more daunting it might seem. Our representatives from the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes mentioned the dauntingness and the thousands of years they've been on the landscape and what's in front of them right now. That's critical to remember. What's in front of us right now. So integration is important as well as scale. Integrating and weaving this in, it's part of everybody's job. It's part of everybody's role. We have lots of layers to this EDRR thing and lots of layers to the invasives issue. And integrating it into everything we do, not just our choir here or our invasive community, but the homeowners associations have a role. The planning and zoning commissions have a role. You know, the highway departments have a role. The people in the business sector have a role. Everybody has a way to integrate something about invasive species management into what they're doing. And that means networking and communication and sharing resources. Sharing resources is critical. The cooperative weed management area associations out there, the CISMAs, the cooperative invasive species management associations, and this collaboration is critical. You can't do it by yourself. You're not going to do this by yourself in isolation. And then we heard about like the snakes in Florida. They don't care what the boundaries are of the national park. They're going to go to Tennessee and listen to music if they can get there. So partnerships mean helping each other and investing in your neighbor, right? So when the mussels were coming at us from the Great Lakes, we should have been investing in the Great Lakes here in this part of the world. And then they got to the 100th meridian. We should have been investing at that point because they're coming at us. Well, they're not here yet, so it's not our problem. And it's at the guy's ranch next door to me, so it's his problem, not my problem. So investing in your neighbor is important to this too. So it may not be easy when you don't have enough resources to feed your own family, but you got to help your neighbor because if the fire skips across his boundary line and burns down your town, maybe we could have helped early on. Risk matters. That's another thing to consider here, risk. Not all of us have the same perspective of what the risks are. For the specialists who deal with an APHIS, my colleagues in And the entomologists out there, you know about the red ambrosia beetle story, right? So we did a great job. We caught it quick. It came into the port. We had it within a quarter mile of the port. We knew it was, there. This exotic beetle had the invasive pathogen on it that could kill trees. Well, it was killing native trees, and they're not really a timber species, not that big a deal. Perhaps that's what some people were thinking, and until it got out. And we let it go because we didn't think the risk was high enough to warrant the energy, perhaps. And then it hit the avocado industry. And we realized, oh, this also affects avocados. Well, it's hard to make guacamole with avocados. So all of a sudden, there's issues there. So things ahead of time. Think ahead of time. Be proactive. Invest in your neighbor. Consider other alternative ideas. Consider that your partners may not be traditional partners. Who should come to the table to talk about the issue and bring their perspective? They are potential supporters, and they're also people who can be integrating invasives into what they do. And it may have nothing to do with the world we work in. Completely off the norm, but that's also a partner opportunity. So investing in your neighbors is important. And this is a long game, right? They're not going away. So long-term thinking, long-term outcomes, long-term parameters that you're setting up ahead of time, long beyond your careers, my careers, long beyond the programs that we have. They're going to have to go into future years, future decades perhaps, to keep this going. It's not as easy. And the fire story, we heard the fire story, incident command structures, great idea, super concept here. When the fires hit, it's all hands on deck. We all put on the same fire gear, the Nomex. We have command structures that allow us to cross the boundaries, and we're not stopping at the border and say, well, can we go on the ranch to do this? No, we're going to go on the ranch, and we're going to deal with it. So it's a team effort, and the state and federal and tribal entities kind of blur in that war against fire. So I think about that same way in invasives. I was reading some stuff about impacts of invasives. Did you know that Forest Service spends in any given year on fire suppression more money than the U.S. government spends on invasives entirely, combined? And if you look at that scale of impact, invasive species impacts, not just the plant side, but insects and diseases, pathogens, threats to agriculture, threats to wildlife, economically and environmentally, a huge problem in this country, a huge problem in North America, a huge problem globally. So invasives, really, the scale of it is much bigger than some of the big natural disasters that we typically spend money on. But the funding and capacity there is much different. It's almost reversed. So we've got to think about that. And unity, policy unity, getting consistent approaches and barriers that are they're holding us up for progress. We got to overcome those and give a little, share a little. Policy actions, financial sharing, overcoming barriers on awareness. We all should be aware, but it goes beyond awareness. It's into action. So yeah, I'm aware, but let's be active about that. Let's change public behavior and support that. And of course, with the power of the Governors Association and the connections that the governors are making to this important national issue and the connections we have with Congress and our state legislatures, it's really a three-branch government, all-hands-on-deck effort. This democracy has the opportunity to really tighten our ship up and work across the borders, across the barriers, across the jurisdictions, across the aisle. And as Governor Bullock mentioned, I think we're all there with invasives. So the more the better of that. And I'll leave you with a couple last things. The time that we spend on prevention is worth it. The money we spend on prevention is worth it. The costs are clearly larger when it gets to be an invasion that is escaped and in place or established. And in some cases, by deflecting the need to deal with those early on and punting the ball, if you will, until it becomes established, we're just adding burden to our futures, to our children, to our neighbors that is not really fair. So it's really a long-term game with conservation in mind and essentially helping ourselves help each other and helping our future. So thanks.
Great, thank you all. Those are some Great perspectives. I would like to focus a little bit on spending. So when looking at spending dollars on invasive species that cover a large range, such as something like cheatgrass, we can often feel like we're fighting a losing battle. So how do you prioritize limited funding when addressing invasive species with different ecological footprints? Any recommendations to create the biggest impact with those limited dollars? Whoever has comments. Go, Mike.
And just say so. There's species. We look at it in a certain way where there's species-driven risk and there's site-driven risk, and so you have to define that at that local level. That's where the action starts right there, and it changes as you go up in scale. So, an example would be maybe you have a very important site like a dam that provides water and electricity, and the infrastructure in that could be impacted by invasion to that, or maybe a rare plant area that's got the last remaining population of a rare plant or a rare animal, and you're trying to protect that site. So these site-driven risk assessments will help define how and where and when and what activity you take to deal with the problem. But then there's also species-driven risk, the things that are commonly dealt with at the agricultural arena. So if you got something that comes in that wipes out, cattle, or citrus, or grapes that make wine, well, the wine industry is going to come unglued, and so you need to get on top of that because that's going to affect the economics and communities and businesses, all kinds of things so that species has to be dealt with right away, immediately. The spotted lanternfly, for example, that just came in, the mad cow disease, CWD, white nose syndrome. Those are species-driven risk kind of things compared to, say, site-driven risk assessment. So both have merit, and so that helps define what and when and how and the cost you might want to incur on those based on those risks.
Great, Rayola.
Well, in Idaho, we developed a different kind of a tool to address cheatgrass on the ground, and that was with our state grazing leases. In Idaho, you cannot apply for a state grazing lease unless you include in that application your vegetation management plan. And that vegetation management plan must contain grazing. We were finding that there were some folks who were outbidding some livestock operators on these particular parcels and not doing anything, and then they were creating a large fire opportunity, and of course it would burn. But since we have the vegetation management plan and the tool, we are finding fewer and fewer range fires in the area where this is implemented on state lands. Now, Owyhee County is 67% federally owned by the BLM, and yet we are now, after the soda fire, which burned thousands of acres, we're implementing some targeted grazing outside the vegetation management plan to create fire breaks. And it has become very effective, and so we're beginning to work with our federal partners and getting them to work with us. There's a lot of distrust about rules and regulations with the federal entities, but we're trying to work through that and build bridges, and something like hydrilla or the boat check stations are helping us to break down barriers and work more cooperatively. So that's what we developed at that. And so I would urge you to just think of what tools you can develop to actually get on the ground and help those people who are on the ground, because if you want to identify a weed or an odd occurrence, talk to your livestock operators. They're there every day. They look at the ground every day. They're the ones that come into us and say, what's this at the CWMA? I found this. I've never seen it before. What is it? And then we can identify that and address it. So thank you.
So we have an approach when we look at what are we going after with limited funding. So we use pest risk analysis. We use our counterparts and colleagues here from APHIS, CPHIS, the research part. They help us do pest risk analysis. There's an NPAC. You guys haven't heard many acronyms yet. That's a new pest advisory group. they look at these new pests and evaluate what is the risk. So this is where we then find out, okay, this is a concern. We obviously have on state side resources as well to evaluate that. But then another aspect is, do we have good tools to find these pests? We'll talk probably here the next couple of days about firewood and how important firewood is as a pathway for a lot of exotic wood borers. Well, we don't have good tools to go after wood borers because we don't have efficient traps like we have for gypsy moth or Japanese beetle. So we won't waste a lot of time there because we can't find them because we don't have the tools. And then the other issues, then also consideration that we have, do we have good eradication tools? We heard about this morning about some stuff. We can go after quagga, mussel, and zebra. Once they're here, they're here. And we have similar situations on the insect side or on noxious weed side. They're very difficult to eradicate. So that's where we have to make then the call. What is more important for us? What can we do? And as I said, gypsy moth, Japanese beetle, at least out in the west, in particular on the west coast, we still go after these two legacy pests because we have good tools and good eradication methods to get rid of them.
Great. Well, funding is a constant challenge, and directing funding to new and emerging challenges is even more difficult. The place where funding is most quickly needed and the likelihood of success is the highest is at the initial point of infestation. But oftentimes we don't have programs and we don't have funding that's made available for that initial attack, which is unfortunate. One thing that I feel like could be discussed at this meeting and across the West is the creation of funding sources or processes to work together across the West and across the state and other administrative boundaries to share resources, fiscal and otherwise. In Washington State, we see the same problem, and what the Invasive Species Council Washington has actually done is proposed the creation of an emergency fund for response to invasive species as part of our next operating budget. And if created, funding would be made available for the initial attack phase of new emergencies. And so not that it's a management fund for programs that have funding elsewhere, but that initial phase where government agencies and others are trying to ramp up and build programs that haven't already existed, this would be kind of a Kickstarter for that initial attack so that we can be more successful in really responding efficiently and effectively. And so I think that we could look at that at a regional level or perhaps even a national scale as well.
Okay, I have a question for you, Mike, down there. So it seems that federal agencies have a growing appreciation for the risk that invasive species pose. How does the Forest Service integrate invasive species management into their many other land management goals and responsibilities?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, integration is really important. So for us, what that means is weaving it in. And so we have policy on this. We have direction to all of our national forests and grasslands, recalling that our agency is very diverse. We have our own research arm, the research and development program, our work with the state and private forestry community, which also includes fire and cooperative forestry and community forestry and things that tie into the, not the land management side, but like the national forest system is 192 million acres of grasslands and forests and tundras and iceland, all kinds of stuff out there, from Alaska to the Caribbean. So we have a lot of stuff going on, so we have to integrate invasive species into all of that. And on the land management side, on the ground part, where we're actually doing this, whether you're in the recreation arena, wilderness managers, for example, are engaged in wilderness stewardship. And so they're tied into documenting, finding, mapping, treating, and restoring areas that have been invaded in wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers. Our rangeland programs for rangeland management and our forest management programs are all integrating. So things like timber sales, incorporating prevention practices in timber sale contracts so we have clean equipment coming into these areas when they're doing it. Fire management, where we've developed through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group prevention practices to integrate invasive species prevention into fire operations. You know, that's an interagency kind of thing too. So whether you're scooping water out of a lake and you want to make sure you don't spread exotic aquatic species from one water body into another basin, just from the fire operations, that's part of integration. That's what we do with policy and direction. And of course, all kinds of other activities that we have on the ground, including our education programs and our outreach programs, teaching children, teaching adults, and of course, people who visit, teaching them and involving them into the process. I'll add to that even increasing capacity with our volunteer programs. And we've just rolled out in the year of 2018, which is the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the National Trail System Act. A new program that's really here for everyone in the country, all landowners, all organizations, all agencies, called Wild Spotter, Mapping Invasives in America's Wild Places. It's a way to help boost the capacity to help find these things, because there's thousands, or not, if not millions, of people in the landscape that are out there. It could be eyes and ears for us, and help us find these things so we can catch them quick and get after them before they become established. That's part of integration as well. So.
Well, I wanted to give an opportunity if there is a question from the audience from this panel before we move on. Okay, great. We have someone in the middle here.
Steve Wanderers, Montana Invasive Species Council. And Justin, you mentioned the Emergency Trust Fund for responding to invasive species. So do you have any unique ideas for funding that?
No, I don't. I'm sorry to say. Maybe we could all chip in with an MOU between Western states. Yeah. No, I think what Mike had alluded to is that, you know, it really gets down to the fact that we need to be looking at our neighbors, and we need to be talking about how we can share resources, whether it's the adjacent ranch owner, whether it's the adjacent county, the adjacent state, or even, you know, your Canadian province. You know, we're all dealing with shared issues. How can we create agreements to move resources, whether they're financial or otherwise? Yeah, public and private partnerships. I think Rayola nailed it on the head too. You know, maybe we should investigate collaborating with businesses and industry and trying to drum up funding that way as well.
So in Oregon, we were able to get about $350,000 a few years ago for the Oregon Invasive Species Council Emergency Fund that came out of the ATV funds from our Park and Recreation Department. So there was a one-time transfer, and we've used it up since then, mostly for Japanese beetle. And we weren't successful. We haven't been successful to replenish it. So we're still working on convincing our legislators that's a good investment.
Do we have any other audience questions? Okay, let's see where we are. Okay, great. I'm going to ask another question to our group here then. So I guess I will address this to Justin, but I think this could apply to others on the panel. So Washington State has a broad range of ecosystems, from coastal rainforests to arid ecosystems in the east, and many natural resource industries, from timber harvest, irrigated agriculture to shellfish. With this wide diversity in economic and environmental conditions, it presents challenges when assessing, or does this present challenges when assessing invasive species risks and or allocating funds?
Yes, absolutely. It creates many challenges. Washington State has very rural areas and very urbanized areas. We have a variety of different ports and shipping hubs, rail lines going through the state. We see a lot of different natural resource industries, from shellfish, aquaculture, to dryland wheat cultivation. And so it seems like from apple maggot to zebra mussel, we see all types of invasive species attacking our economy and our natural resources. I think that we've seen a lot of success in working across these issues. We are effectively keeping invasive mussels out of the state, protecting our irrigation and our hydroelectric dams and our fish passage. We've eradicated feral swine in numerous instances. they're not established. We've successfully eradicated numerous invasive insects that would have really been crippling to our industry and our natural resources. That said, the biggest challenge we face, being that we could be dealing with any kind of new invasive species issue, is knowing when to pull the trigger on emergency response. So if something new shows up, we don't have time to set up studies to see what crops will be affected. By the time that study's complete, we may have lost billions in economic damages, and we really struggle with that. So being that we are so diverse and there's so many pathways, how do we make well-informed decisions quickly? And getting back to some of my points earlier, I feel like there's a real need for Western or national technical advisory groups to help states make better informed decisions in a timely manner. So that would be my response to that.
Thanks, Justin. A final question here to Helmuth. Agricultural producers are often the citizens with the most knowledge and appreciation of invasive species impacts. When producers find invasive weeds on their property that are affecting their crops, what's the mechanism to help pay for that? Is it out of pocket? Is it industry partners? Or is it a state funding source for these folks?
It's a mixed situation. So the state, so my noxious weed program goes out and does the weed survey. We have, very similar to many other Western states, we have A-rated weeds that are not established or not known to occur or very limited. We go after them on every level. Then we have B-rated, like Scotch broom, like blackberry, which is widely spread, and then it's up to the county or the private owner what to do about that for their own protection or their keeping the value. So if a landowner wants to do something, it depends what kind of weed it is. If it's A-rated, B-rated. If it's A-rated, we will do the job for them. We have a lot of funding also we receive from BLM or Forest Service or Forest Service. So it's a multitude of agencies, again, working together with the private landowners.
Great. Okay, well, we are transitioning to a new panel, so please join me in thanking